Thank you very much for that. I definitely want to hear myself speak now. And I hope I'm up to it. This is the other thing about tweeting, which I'm just old enough not to have really got tweeting, is that it places an obligation on the speaker to say something immediately important enough to be worth communicating outside the room. Anyway, I'm going to have a go. I'm just about old enough to remember a time when it wasn't at all obvious that engaging the community in questions of policing was a good thing to do at all. I can remember an age when the kind of dominant orthodoxy was that the police were the professionals, they knew about crime and what to do about it, that policing was a complex business that no one outside the organisation could really understand, that the police had some kind of organic relationship to the British public that enabled them to discern exactly what the public were thinking and wanted them to do, and it really could be just left to them. All that started to change back in the 1980s. It was an issue in the disputes that took place between local authorities and their chief constables at the time. It was a central issue in trying to explain what happened in the urban disorders of the early 1980s. And of course all that gave rise to Section 106 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act and the community consultation arrangements, and we've never looked back since. We've also never entirely lost sight of the charge that all that happens when you engage people with the police is that the worried well come along and talk about dog poo, but more of that later. But in the kind of 20 or 30 years since, we've been through citizens' charters, neighbourhood policing, confidence targets, and the like. All of which has meant that what started life, and it's worth kind of remembering this, what started life as a radical demand of the police has in the last 30 years become a mainstream activity for the police. Now, as John mentioned, the 15th of November of this year is going to be a unique day in British political history. The public, at least we hope, are going to turn out and elect a police and crime commissioner for each force in what will be a constitutionally unique election. Never before in this country have we decided to elect public officials to run a single public service. And none of us in this room really know how that's going to turn out. But on the surface, at least, it would seem to be the case that this will usher in a further extension of community engagement with the police. The government's defence of this initiative is this is about a shift from what they call bureaucratic to democratic accountability. This is about the abandonment of central control and central targets towards an agenda of localism and local determination of police priorities. PCCs are going to be powerful figures who will give effect to local concerns, ensure the police answer to public priorities and not their own, and significantly going to have a range of powers to make sure that happens, in extremis, dismissing the chief officer without cause. On the surface at least, PCCs would seem to be a novel and powerful way of trying to reconnect the police and the public. Now, at the risk of being someone who's here to spoil the party, I'm not so sure. Or at the very least, I want us to treat as an open question whether or not PCCs are going to be a good thing when it comes to improving public engagement. To make this case, or at least to pose that question seriously, I want in the next 20 minutes to do three things. Firstly, I want to kind of situate PCCs within the government's wider police reform agenda, because I think you can only understand their dominant meaning, by which I mean the meaning that their authors want us to attach to them, if you situate it in that context. Secondly, I want to make the case, and my title, I have to do some of this, it's in my title, I want to make the case for why community engagement in the police does and should matter, and how we might best think about it. And having done that, I want to return to the question of PCCs and think about some of the perils and possibilities that might attend this new initiative. Now, police and crime commissioners are the flagship of what many have remarked is an ambitious government reform programme in this field, which has left many experts and police officers aghast at both its scale and speed. And a number of the people at the beginning of the conference have alluded to this. As I said, my case is you can only really understand PCCs if you think about them in the context of that wider reform programme. So how are we to understand that agenda? Why are the government moving so far and so fast in the area of police reform, and one might add, with such apparent disdain for police opinion? Why have police and crime commissioners and this particular attempt to give effect to a notion of democratic accountability, something that was once a cause of the municipal left in this country, emanated from, of all places, the Conservative Party. Now, one answer to these questions is that what's currently going on in terms of the coalition and policing is the kind of returning to unfinished business, returning to an agenda which was started and not finished at the time of the Sheehy report back in the early 1990s. In other words, on this view, the government have come to see the police as the last unreformed public bureaucracy and have seen an unrivaled opportunity, a small window, if you like, to do something about it. Hence the scale, hence the speed, hence the determination to brook no opposition. My view is there's something in this, but it only takes us so far. What it doesn't do is illuminate the substance of what the government is trying to do, or tell us much about the end game. What kind of police force is supposed to emerge from the coalition's reform programme? My answer to this question goes something like this, that the government are in the business of trying to release the police's inner crime fighter. By this I mean, is I think the government reasons that inside every police force there is a lean, mean, crime-fighting machine struggling to get out. That machine has over recent decades been shackled by, among other things, excessive bureaucracy, targets, regulation, legal rules and the like, by deferential police authorities, by remote liberal-minded chief officers, and a whole number of other things were to go on. In other words, the government has therefore set itself the task of trying to liberate, to free the police from these shackles in order that they can, as Theresa May put it, and may put it again this afternoon, concentrate on just one objective, to cut crime. I haven't got time to go through this in detail, but it seems to me that you can best understand such things as the drive to eliminate regulation and waste and bureaucracy and excessive legal rules, the proposals ushered in by the Windsor Report on police paying conditions, the government support for the outsourcing of police services to the private sector, the introduction of crime maps to empower consumers to pressurise their local force. All of that, I think, and I won't do it now, all of that, I think, can be interpreted as a means of trying to do this, to release the shackles from the police, to put more officers on the front line, and to allow them to carry on resolutely in this crime-fighting mode. So let us return to PCCs and try and examine them in that context. The aim, the government says, of PCCs is to give people a direct voice in how their areas are policed, in order that the police can be made to concentrate on those crimes which most affect local citizens' quality of life. They have always been presented, and I confess this has always slightly puzzled me, as a mechanism for reducing crime. How is this supposed to be the case? It seems to me that the logic goes something like this, that PCCs are meant to be, as the jargon has it, a disruptive technology which upsets what the government thinks are cosy and opaque relationships between chief constables and police officers, so that the PCCs can drive a kind of better performance management. In the political imagination of their authors, PCCs are meant to do one of two things. Either they're meant to be a constant thorn in the side of chief officers, focusing their minds day in, day out on the business of driving up performance and driving down crime, or they're meant to form some kind of dynamic crime-fighting duo, a sort of Giuliani-Bratton British style. There may be some people in the room, of course, who imagine themselves in that role, for which apologies. Now, if you understand PCCs like this, I am not sure that this is a recipe for extending public engagement. Of course, as John has mentioned, there are certain statutory responsibilities that PCCs will have by means of trying to represent the views of their electorate, seek the views of victims, and so on and so forth. But it might not go much further than that if a PCC has convinced themselves that their job is to be a crime fighter and to get their chief constable to do the same. If you understand PCCs like that, they become a force they become a figure who is acting resolutely for the people, rather than one that necessarily sees themselves as being in a constant dialogue with the people. Now, this idea, the idea that the police are first and foremost crime fighters, is one that has a powerful and seductive appeal within English social life. It has a kind of obviousness which is quite difficult to gainsay. If the police aren't in the business of cutting crime, what on earth are they supposed to be doing? But I think we should be clear that this is a myth. To describe it as a myth is not to suggest that somehow the police shouldn't be involved in responding to and investigating crime, or that somehow the police are not one of the institutions in our society that we use to try and keep crime under control and foster public security. I'm not suggesting that for a minute. What I am suggesting is this account of the police as being first and foremost crime fighters rests on a partial account of what we know about what the police do, and an impoverished account of the more basic question of why the police matter. Now, in relation to the first, the late Canadian police sociologist Jean-Paul Bourdieu in his last book, I think, interestingly pointed out that we are becoming increasingly preoccupied in recent years in the question of what works, to the exclusion of the question of what happens. He makes this point in order to say that in contemporary policing we've rather lost sight of 40 years of cross-jurisdictional police sociology, which has actually tried to work out what police officers spend most of their time doing, rather than what we might want police officers to spend most of their time doing. He demonstrates in his review of this evidence that most of that research demonstrates that a minority of calls from the public to the police have to do with crime, and that a minority of police officers' time is actually spent on crime-related matters. He concludes from this, and he stands in a long line of police sociologists who've come to this view, that the police have a kind of omnibus mandate to do with the regulation of social conflict and the management of order, of which crime is only but a part. As Egon Bittner once famously quipped, the police are the organisation people turn to when something is happening that ought not to be happening and about which someone ought to be doing something now. What the police bring to the party when those things happen is the capacity to use non-negotiable coercive force. It turns out, and this is Bourdieu's point, that lots of the things that ought not to be happening aren't easily registered as crime. But this crime-fighting conception of policing also offers a rather limited answer to that more basic question of why the police matter. Now, one of the other things that police sociologists emphasised over the years, and I would say this, wouldn't I, because I've been responsible for some of it, is that what the police symbolise is almost as important in sustaining public confidence and public security as what they actually do. The police are an organisation that cannot but help send authoritative signals which sustain or undermine people's sense that they live in an ordered place and their sense of where they fit within the hierarchy of that place. Police activity allocates censure and affirms trust in ways that speak volumes about both the nature of social relations and the quality of how we are governed. Policing is thus a sensitive indicator of how well any society is looking after the well-being and security of its members. Messages, one should add, that are often more powerful and more sensitive among those sections of any political community where that sense of membership is rather more precarious or contested. This, it seems to me, is why policing matters. This, it seems to me, is why policing continue to attract the kind of stories that the Lord Dear just mentioned, why it continues to generate the kinds of emotional reactions we've seen it generate in a whole series of instances over just the last 6 weeks, and why it generates so powerful and emotional and conflicting calls for action. All this is why policing matters, and it includes, but does not reduce to, the question of how to reduce crime. So what lessons should we learn from this? I think there are two, or at least I can only think of two for the moment. The first of these is it matters not only that the police go about the business of investigating crime, regulating conflict and managing order, but how they do so. This seems to me to be the key lesson of what has become an impressive body of research on procedural justice over recent decades. Procedural justice theories have emphasised, indeed demonstrated, that people's sense of the legitimacy of the police, and indeed their compliance with legal authority, depends greatly on how they feel they are treated in encounters with officers. Indeed, the claim has been shown that people are often much more concerned about the perceived fairness of those encounters, whether police officers treat them with dignity and respect, whether they have a say, whether they think those officers are neutral and open-minded about the outcome, than they are about the outcomes of those encounters. Encounters, one might say, are properly thought of in the context of this conference, a form of very direct and, of course, often unwanted community engagement with the police. Every single one of them, as Tom Tyler, the American psychologist, emphasizes, is what he calls a teachable moment. It leaves a trace. It signals to people something about the police, how they go about their work, and what they stand for. Learning the lessons of procedural justice and trying to find ways of implementing them into police practice seems to me to be one important lesson of that question of why the police matter. The second, it seems to me, is to underscore the importance of finding institutional arrangements for making the police democratically accountable for what they do. To be sure, if you want to go down this road, and of course PCCs are a giant step down this road, one has to attend seriously to the question of how you protect the operational responsibility of chief officers. One has to have all kinds of legitimate rule of law and human rights concerns about what happens to minorities in such a setting. But it seems to me that the police are not, as Shami Chakrabarti has recently taken to arguing, just simply part of the fixed part of the British Constitution. Police forces routinely are in the business of allocating resources, of determining priorities, of styles of policing, of deciding what to put resources into and what not to, which materially affect the lives of all citizens and in which those citizens have a legitimate stake. And it seems to me that in this more kind of macro or policy context, we can also learn some lessons from the procedural justice literature. If in a time of austerity when there are not enough resources to go round, if even more acutely than usual, police forces are in the business of trying to manage expectations, not all of which they are ever able to meet, then it matters enormously to the legitimacy of those decisions that people are given a say in how those decisions are arrived at. Giving people a say also increases the amount of information that goes into the making of those decisions and thereby enhances their quality. In other words, democratic processes of community engagement matter. They matter enormously, and they matter to both the legitimacy and the quality of policing policy in practice. Now, with this in mind, let me say a few words about PCCs. I've sometimes in the last 18 months felt like the only person who wasn't a member of the Conservative Party who thought that the PCCs weren't the worst idea that anyone had thought of. The reason that I arrived at that view is because it always struck me that the PCCs are a flawed means of trying to give institutional effect to three important principles. Firstly, they're an answer to the question of how do we make police forces responsive to the experiences and concerns of the multiple publics they serve. Secondly, it just seems to me to be a matter of democratic principle that if you live in a liberal democracy, the strategic priorities of large public services, the police included, are made by elected politicians and not unelected officials, in this case, chief constables. Thirdly, we need to reckon with the fact that Britain, and Britain is not alone among modern democracies in this context, faces a crisis of trust in its political system. Levels of trust and confidence in politicians are at an all-time low, as I don't need to tell most of you in this room. Now, it seems to me that in that context, one can just go on doing the same old things in the same old institutions in the hope that things will somehow get better. Or one can experiment and innovate and try new ways of trying to engage people in the political process. Whether you like it or not, it seems to me that PCCs can be most generously interpreted as an attempt to experiment in democracy, to try and find new ways of extending involvement in the political process. The flaws, I said they were a flawed means of giving effect. The flaws are this. The flaw, it's too late to shift this now. The flaw is trying to think that it is best done by embodying all this in one individual. The flaw, which relates more crucially to what I've had to say today, is situating the PCC in this mould of police as crime fighter. Because it seems to me that many of the worries and fears and dangers that critics of PCCs associate with the idea flow from, or at least are amplified by, the situating of PCCs in this crime-fighting mould. The more PCCs persuade themselves that they are crime fighters, the more likely it seems to me they are to step on the operational toes of chief officers, to interfere in investigations, and to dismiss those officers who are deemed to be recalcitrant or not playing their crime-fighting card. The more a PCC thinks of themselves as a crime fighter, the less likely it seems to me they are to engage in inclusive public debate in those localities, and the more likely they are shore up their popularity by targeting the usual unpopular suspects. The more they ask themselves to be, and this is a salutary warning to those of you who are about to stand for election, the more it seems to me they ask to be judged by the success of them or their police force in cutting crime, the more they're going to be hoisted by that petard when the 2016 elections come round. Now, there may be some parts of the country in which it does turn out like that. But it seems to me also important to remember, and this is how I've always thought about PCCs, that this is ultimately a piece of constitutional reform. What PCCs are is a way of radically recalibrating the relationship between citizens and an important public service. If you take that seriously, and if you take seriously the government's stated aim of moving control over policing from the centre to localities, one of the things that immediately becomes pointed out is that how PCCs end up on the ground is beyond the control of its authors. In other words, a space exists for police and crime commissioners to give effect to a more civic and deliberative conception of policing, and to think of their role, at least in large part, if not exclusively, as trying to run what I've described elsewhere with Rick Moore as an office for public engagement. In other words, that part of what it might mean to be a good PCC is to engage oneself day in, day out in the slow, difficult, painful, but indispensable task of trying to experiment and in new ways of involving people in an ongoing conversation about crime and security problems in their neighbourhoods. Now, there might, this is my final thought, there might just here be an irony in this question of turnout. Many people in this room, as indeed many others, are currently fretting about whether you persuade anyone to turn out on what is apparently going to be a dark and wet and cold November night, because they always are, to take part in these elections. And there's a kind of game going on about what would count as success. Is it 10? Is it 15? Might we get up to 30? No one, in short, is very hopeful. But there might actually be an unintended benefit of a low turnout. A low turnout might persuade everyone who is elected on the 16th of November that they haven't actually got a massive popular mandate to implement a policy of crime fighting, and actually remind them that they are a politician of a new kind, occupying what is a unique public office. And that part of the responsibilities of that unique public office is to try and sustain a more inclusive, an improved quality conversation among all those affected by policing about how to go about delivering crime reduction and order maintenance on the ground. Thank you very much.